Here's a question for you. If someone criticizes your school or where you work, does it feel like a personal insult? For some people it does. You might be one of those people who have a lot of themselves tied up in the organizations they belong to. For other people, not so much. Those people have much more of a psychological distance between themselves and their organizations. Social psychologists refer to these as differences in organizational identification, meaning the degree to which people use their organizations to help understand who they personally are. Let me explain that concept of organizational identification a little more. Then I can tell you about some research I've done looking at how organizational identification can help us understand why company CEOs, chief executive officers, may or may not engage in self-serving behavior. Let's start off by recognizing that each of us has our own personal identity. Your identity is basically your own definition of your own self. What do you see as your central characteristics that are relatively enduring across time and situation and that help make you distinctive from other people? That's your identity. Now you can think about the organizations you belong to as also having identities. To make this simple, pick out one organization that you belong to. What do you see as that organization's central characteristics that are relatively enduring across time and situation and that help make that organization distinctive from other organizations? That's your organization's identity. Notice how this is your conception of the organization's identity. Other people may see the same organization differently from the way you see it. Okay, now consider how much overlap there is between the two identities. In other words, how much do you use your organization's identity to help define your own identity? To what degree would it be helpful for others to understand your organization in order to understand who you really are? Some people have a high overlap between their own identity and the organization's identity. They have high organizational identification. One way you can tell is they probably refer to their organization as we rather than they. For example, we hired a new employee or we are rolling out a new product. They introduce themselves to new people by referring immediately to their organization. And if you were to wake them up in the middle of the night and ask, "Who are you?" they probably refer to their organization to describe themselves because that would be the first thing that comes to mind. Other people have low overlap between their own identity and the organization's identity. They have low organizational identification. The organization is the last way they would refer to themselves, the last way they would introduce themselves to somebody at a party. And they probably talk about the organization as them or they rather than as we. For example, they hired a new employee or they rolled out a new product. We all differ on this dimension, and we all fall somewhere on the continuum between high organizational identification and low organizational identification. One reason that organizational identification matters in the real world is that it is associated with a whole range of positive outcomes for the organization, including less self-serving behavior. Studies have shown that relative to organizational members with lower levels of organizational identification, members with higher levels are more likely to be committed to the organization, to put in more work effort, and to go above and beyond their job descriptions to be helpful to the organization, its employees, and its customers. The basic idea behind these attitudinal outcomes and behavioral outcomes is that members who identify more strongly with the organization are less likely to prioritize or even distinguish between their own self-interest and the interests of the organization. People higher on the organizational identification dimension are less likely to take advantage of the organization when given the opportunity. They actually would see hurting the organization as hurting themselves. Most of the research on the positive effects of organizational identification has been done with members who are not at the top of the organization. But my colleagues and I have conducted a few studies looking at CEO organizational identification. One takeaway is that CEOs, just like other organizational members, can fall anywhere on the organizational identification continuum, from high identification to low. At first blush, that might seem strange, as you might expect that individuals would be selected to be CEO in part because of their high psychological overlap with the organization. But consider that some CEOs identify more with the profession of being a CEO than with the particular organization, and would be perfectly happy to pick up their portfolio and move to be the CEO at another organization. Other CEOs are so psychologically attached to their organization that it would be virtually inconceivable for them to leave for another organization. One interesting outcome that we have found in our research is that CEOs with higher organizational identification are more likely to engage in a type of leadership called servant leadership. Servant leadership is about showing sensitivity to others' personal concerns, putting subordinates first, helping subordinates grow and succeed, empowering others, and creating value for the community. In another study, we examined governance in the organization. We start with the recognition that CEOs have a considerable amount of power and discretion in the organization, and that good governance means that the CEO is reined in to ensure that she or he is indeed working on behalf of the organization and its stakeholders rather than on behalf of self. An outcome that might signal good governance is the degree to which the CEO's compensation and perks are tightly coupled with the performance of the organization. When they are tightly coupled, the CEO is rewarded when the firm performs well. When the firm performs poorly, the CEO's rewards go down. Prior researchers have observed that board independence is key to good governance. When a firm's board is truly independent from the CEO, meaning that the board members are not working for the CEO or close friends of the CEO, the firm is more likely to have a structure where CEO compensation and perks are tightly coupled to firm performance. Our research question was, could CEO organizational identification also serve to rein in the CEO? We predicted that there will be tighter coupling of CEO compensation and perks to firm performance in organizations where the CEO's organizational identification is higher. Again, the theoretical argument is that CEOs with higher levels of organizational identification are simply less likely to see a significant distinction between their own interests and the organization's interests, and therefore would be less likely to take advantage of their power in the organization to decouple their rewards from the performance of the firm. We conducted our study using a sample of large North American firms. We specifically looked at firms with poor financial performance, and we measured the degree to which the CEOs of those firms were getting large cash payouts and were using the corporate aircraft extensively for personal purposes. It can be argued that not only is it bad governance for a CEO in a poorly performing firm to get a lot of compensation and perks, it is also unethical. It's an indication that the CEO is exploiting her or his power to pursue self-interest at the expense of the firm and its stakeholders. Using a survey measure, we examined the degree of organizational identification among our CEOs of interest. We had data on 793 CEOs in our study, and we found that given poor firm performance, those CEOs with higher organizational identification were much less likely to get large cash payouts and were much less likely to use the corporate aircraft for personal purposes. Further, we found that board independence simply wasn't as important a factor in reining in CEO behavior when the CEO had high organizational identification. CEOs with higher levels of organizational identification seem to be controlling themselves without the need for the external monitoring function of the independent board. We found that to be a fascinating result, but it led us to ask, if a social psychological factor like CEO organizational identification can substitute for an organizational control structure like an independent board, how might control structures in the organization affect the degree to which the CEO has organizational identification in the first place? To answer that question, we had to investigate what leads to CEO identification. Most of the research to date on predictors of organizational identification had been done at lower levels of the organization. We drew heavily on that research because we expected that factors leading to identification in lower level members may not differ greatly in their general form from factors that predict identification in CEOs. However, we also predicted and expected that the distinctive features of the CEO position would mean that those factors will manifest themselves quite differently at the CEO level. The predictors that we made were in three categories. In the first category, we predicted that positive press coverage and positive firm performance would cause the CEO to draw psychologically closer to the firm. By identifying with a firm that is well-liked and that's performing well, the CEO can enhance her or his own esteem. In the second category, we predicted that the more the CEO's financial interests were aligned with the firm's interests, the more the CEO would naturally be psychologically drawn to the organization. Thus, we predicted that the more the CEO owned the firm and the more the CEO's own pay was tied to the performance of the firm, the more the CEO would identify with the firm. In the third category, we predicted that structural controls put in place to restrict the CEO's autonomy and to keep the CEO from engaging in self-serving behavior would have the effect of driving the CEO away from the firm psychologically. Thus, we predicted that higher levels of board independence and higher levels of institutional ownership of the firm would both decrease the degree to which the CEO would identify with the firm. In our study, in which we used surveys to measure CEO organizational identification and archival records to measure the firm's image, performance, and structure, our predictions were confirmed. Here's an interesting takeaway from that study. As I said previously, CEOs have a considerable amount of power and discretion in the organization, and good governance means that the CEO is reined in to ensure that she or he is working on behalf of the organization and its stakeholders, rather than on behalf of self. Traditionally, there are two means for keeping the CEO under control: intrinsically oriented means and extrinsically oriented means. The intrinsically oriented means attempt to align the CEO's financial interests with those of the firm and its stakeholders. We found that those means tend to strengthen the CEO's organizational identification. The extrinsically oriented means attempt to structurally control the CEO. They attempt to monitor the CEO and limit her or his autonomy. We found that those extrinsically oriented means tend to weaken the CEO's organizational identification. Looking at these two studies together provide some interesting insights for good governance design. In the first study, we found that CEO organizational identification is beneficial for the organization, as it helps to ensure that the CEO is working on behalf of the firm and its stakeholders. In the second study, we found that extrinsic controls, which are themselves intended to rein in the CEO's self-serving behavior, can actually reduce that beneficial CEO organizational identification. Extrinsic controls, designed with the best intentions, can end up having counterproductive effects. Our recommendation is that all things equal, in order to foster beneficial CEO organizational identification, boards should focus on aligning the CEO's interests with the firm's interests and de-emphasize CEO autonomy reduction. So now you know a little bit more about organizational identification, how it might be beneficial at the CEO level in organizations, and how governance mechanisms in the organization might foster it or diminish it. But I'm going to leave you with a question that's inspired some of my further research. Is CEO organizational identification always beneficial? One indication that it might not be comes from a real-life example. Jeffrey Skilling, the then CEO of Enron, declared in the middle of Enron's glory days, just before its spectacular collapse, that I am Enron. That's a pretty strong declaration of organizational identification, but we now know that Skilling was involved in a high degree of self-serving behavior. CEO organizational identification that leads to self-serving behavior? That's a puzzle we address in some subsequent research.